We've talked already about the bake sale that will happen right after we dismiss here for Karha. Jumi let me know this morning as well. We could use about, I think, somewhere between 7 and 8 volunteers to go help do some work at the airport here in Fort Pierce with missionary flights as they are trying to load a plane that will be making its way over to Haiti on Tuesday morning with a number of supplies that will be headed that direction. And so if you are able to help Tuesday at 9 at Missionary Flights International, I'll go up there myself to go help. If you're able to do that as well, let me know maybe right after service, and we can plan to go together and join each other up there. Like I said, they're looking for roughly 7 to 8 volunteers to help load one of the containers or one of the planes. I wasn't completely clear about that, but if you're able to help, please let me know, and let's go do that together. Okay, so we've been in a series now for 6 weeks, and we're wrapping that up today, a series that we have called Life in Exile. And during this series, we've been looking at the book of Daniel, and really we've been allowing the book of Daniel to answer a number of questions that I believe that we as Christians have been wrestling with as we've seen things around us changing, as we've seen things in this nation changing, but not just this nation, the West in general. Certainly we've seen the attitudes surrounding us, of the surrounding culture in particular, change toward Christianity. I was reading a book a number of years ago, a really good book called Live No Lies. I'd suggest it to you if you are into reading books. And in this book, the author makes the point that to be Christian in this nation at one point in time meant that you would likely be held in high regard or be counted as trustworthy simply because you called yourself a Christian. And he said, what's wild is we live in a time where that is almost flipped on its head. And where if you call yourself a Christian, you will find yourself in pockets within society where people will immediately assume they cannot trust you or should not trust you because you call yourself a Christian. Now again, that's the surrounding culture. Okay, now certainly here within this fellowship, and we know with other Christians, if you call yourself a Christian, oftentimes that's still viewed very positively. But even some of the recent polls and recent studies that have been done have shown that that is not the case with much of the surrounding culture. That when you call yourself a Christian, that is not regarded positively. And so we've been asking a couple of questions for the last 6 weeks. The first one is this: how do we as Christians, how do we thrive in a time in which specific elements of the surrounding culture are becoming increasingly hostile to the worldview which we hold? Okay, and then the second one is very much like it or flows right out of it. What kind of character, attitude, and actions will be required to follow Jesus faithfully as the culture around us continues to shift? Now, again, that's why we've looked at the book of Daniel, because of kind of the hypothesis or thesis that the book of Daniel helps us understand how we ourselves, as we are living in exile, not quite like Daniel and his friends were living in exile, but as we find ourselves, as the Apostle Peter says, kind of as strangers and aliens or exiles, as we find ourselves living in exile in some way, shape, or form as followers of Jesus, how can we truly thrive in the midst of a culture that's becoming increasingly hostile? And what kind of attitudes and actions and character ought we to embody if we're going to follow Jesus faithfully? So real quick, a review of what we've learned in this series, okay? Here's what we've learned. First, what we need today, and all these will have what we need statements, okay? So this is the first 6 weeks in a nugget. If any of these kind of pique your interest, you can go back on our website and find the message there, download our app. You can listen to the messages there as well. But what we need today are Christians who are willing to make the choice to once again be winsomely resolute. Okay, if you're not sure what winsomely resolute is, look up winsome, look up resolute, and you'll see, put those together, you'll get an understanding of the kind of people that we're called to be, even in the face of maybe persecution, if it were to come, or maybe just judgment upon us for being who we are. Well, we smile and we treat people with the kindness of Jesus anyway, right? Then what we said in the second week, what we need today are Christians who are once again remember that the God they serve is more powerful and more capable than anyone, or we said anything, who would stand in his way. So we learned that. We also learned this, that what we need today are Christians who once again remember that faithfulness is not a means to an end, but an end itself. In other words, we are not faithful because we believe God is going to do this particular thing. Remember Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? They said, we'll be faithful to God even if he doesn't save us. We're not going to bow down to your idol. Faithfulness is the end, and then we leave the rest up to God. Okay? We said in the fourth week, what we need today are Christians who have a genuine, prayerful heart, just as Daniel had this heart of compassion for Nebuchadnezzar, who was not really a good guy, right? He was ruthless. He was very arrogant, very boastful, prideful. But Daniel continued to have a heart of compassion toward Nebuchadnezzar. And so we said, what we need today are Christians who have a genuine, prayerful heart for those who are our leaders. The New Testament guides us to this as well, whether they are good leaders or not. That's not the point. The point is our faithfulness in the way that we pray for those leaders, whether they are good leaders or not. We said in the next week, what we need today are Christians who live in such a way that they become influencers while not allowing themselves to be influenced. And then finally, last week, what we said is this: what we need today are Christians who are resolved to pursue faithfulness to God over the course of a lifetime. Remember last week in Daniel chapter 6, as Daniel is 82 or 83 years old and is being thrown in a lion's den, the same Daniel who was when he was 16 or 17 said, no, I'm not going to compromise myself, was saying at 82 or 83, I'm still going to serve God with everything I have. And so the call as Christians is to be resolved to pursue faithfulness to God over the course of a lifetime. And so today we're going to wrap up this series, and you may say, wait a minute, there are quite a few chapters of Daniel left. There's 7 through 12, but all of 7 through 12 deal with a similar thing, a very similar issue, a number of visions that Daniel experiences, giving him insight into what was to come. So Daniel 7 through 12, we see a series of dreams and visions, all pointing essentially to the same thing. So we're going to bring those together in one message, and you're going to see what I think the point, the overarching point of all of these dreams and visions ultimately is. Okay, so these dreams and series of visions, plus Nebuchadnezzar's dream in chapter 2, which you'll see will actually borrow some imagery from chapter 2 as well, act as predictive prophecy. Okay, I want you to get that clear in your mind. They act as predictive prophecy for what was to come. Now that is a big deal. Okay, if I were to tell you, I mean, what if I were a prophet and I could foretell the future? Right? So I were to tell you, hey, 3 days from now, this thing is going to happen. Well, you want to see, am I right? So you'd be counting down the 3 days, and if at the end of those 3 days I was correct, well, you'd think some pretty serious and special things about me, right? You'd think, well, Paul's a prophet. He knows what's coming. Now I'm here to tell you, I'm not a prophet. I don't know what's going to happen in 3 days, so don't ask me. You make it up yourself, and hopefully, we'll see. But Daniel was a prophet. And Daniel received visions that allowed him to do exactly what I just talked about, to see into the future. And to not just be able to say 3 days from now this is going to happen, but 100 years from now this will happen, and 200 years from now this will happen, 400 years, and maybe on into the future until this whole ball that we call Earth stops spinning and Jesus returns. Daniel was able to see these things because God enabled him to see these things. Now, here's what I want you to know, and I want to acknowledge this before we jump into this text. And this is important. There is strong pushback about the date of the writing of the book of Daniel among skeptical scholars. Now, you may be familiar with that, and you may know that. But the reason there's strong pushback from these skeptical scholars is because the vast majority of the skeptical scholars deny the existence of the supernatural and rule out the foretelling of the future as a possible. Does that make sense? So they would look at the book of Daniel and they say, hold on. Daniel is actually written after most of these things have been fulfilled, as opposed to before these things foretelling the future. Okay, so these scholars, just to be honest, and it's good, I think when we look at skeptical scholarship, we don't get to the place where we are absorbed with skeptical scholarship, but we do need to acknowledge skeptical scholarship and understand that it's there so that we're aware of it. Does that make sense? I mean, we do that with all scholarship because there are times where you may be having a conversation with an unbelieving friend, and I want you to be equipped. So if you ever have a conversation with someone, and I can remember the first conversation I had with someone who did not believe that Daniel was written during the time of exile, during the time of the Jewish exile, the time of captivity in Babylon. And what was really interesting was I was sitting across the table from a rabbi, a Jewish rabbi who did not believe that Daniel was written in the time of Babylonian captivity. And so I was able to share with him some of the things that I'm going to share with you right now. But these scholars want to date the writing of Daniel to about 165 BC during the Maccabean period. And there's a reason for that. That was a time of real struggle and strife for the Jewish people as they were under attack and trying to once again reestablish their homeland. And they did semi-successfully at points in time. So the belief is that the book of Daniel was written to these people to assure them that victory was coming and don't lose hope, but it was written during that time. Now, there are a whole bunch of problems with actually dating it at 165 BC. So the assertion then, of course, is this, that Daniel's dreams were not prophecy at all, since most of what they deal with was already or had already happened. I mean, that's the assertion that these skeptical scholars are making. So here's the question I want to ask you. Is there evidence, or maybe this is the question you're asking me, is there evidence that should cause us to be skeptical about the claims of these skeptical scholars? And the answer is yes. There is plenty of evidence, and I'm just going to give you 3 strong pieces of evidence for a date of the writing during the time of Babylonian captivity, and not 165. And this matters because if these things were written in 165, then much of what they deal with has already been fulfilled, and it's not really prophecy. But if what was written during the Babylonian captivity, then we learn an awful lot about who Daniel was and the veracity of these visions. Okay, so is there evidence? Absolutely there is. So we're just going to deal with a few pieces of this, and we're going to deal them in order of the chapters. But if we look at Daniel chapter 4, and again, this is just one piece of evidence. One piece of evidence. The first is this, Nebuchadnezzar's boastful claims. Now, you may be wondering, well, what boastful claims are you talking about? And we're referencing this one from verse 30 in particular, where Nebuchadnezzar, remember, this is right before he starts behaving like an animal and is driven out of his palace and starts eating grass and is covered in dew and his nails grow long and his hair is all shaggy. Remember, this is what got him to that place where God humbled him. When Nebuchadnezzar stands up a year after Daniel had made the prophecy about what was going to happen, he stands up and he's looking over his palace and he says, "Is this not the great Babylon I have built?" There's a claim in there, right? Nebuchadnezzar is saying, "I'm the one who built this. Is this not the great Babylon I have built as the royal residence by my mighty power and for the glory of my majesty?" Now, here's what's really important to know. During the time of the Maccabees, Greek scholars believe that there was a queen named Semiramis who was responsible for the building of Babylon. That was believed during the time of the Maccabees. So if this book had been written during the time of the Maccabees, they most likely would not have claimed that Nebuchadnezzar was the one who had built Babylon. They would not have. But over the last roughly 100 years, archaeologists have discovered cuneiform tablets that confirm the claim of Daniel chapter 4 concerning Nebuchadnezzar that he was actually the one who built this. But before the finding of these tablets, it was not known that Nebuchadnezzar was the one who built it, except in Daniel chapter 4. Okay, and that's significant. Because historians during the time of the Maccabees, 165 roughly, agreed that, no, it was actually this queen Semiramis that had built Babylon. But no, it was actually Nebuchadnezzar, just as Daniel chapter 4 says. Now this one's also significant. Belshazzar's existence. Now we dealt with him 2 weeks ago. Remember, he was the king that saw the writing on the wall when he's throwing the party, and they're using the cups that were from the temple really in a very profane way. Well, here's the deal with Belshazzar. Many of these skeptical scholars, up until 1854, and you'll see this in just a second, actually claimed, look, Belshazzar is a made-up figure. He doesn't even exist. So there's a reason that this whole text, as we read Daniel, is wrong, because there's no evidence whatsoever for a guy named Belshazzar to ever have existed in history. And with what they had at that point in time, that was exactly what it was. There was no evidence. No evidence, no Babylonian evidence, no evidence outside of Babylon, nothing until 1854. There were no extra biblical sources that mentioned Belshazzar whatsoever prior to the discovery of an ancient Babylonian text found in 1854, when we actually see Nabonidus, who was Belshazzar's father, who was kind of an absentee ruler who spent most of his time about 450 miles south of Babylon. And Belshazzar ruled in his stead, which again, remember, when Belshazzar says, Daniel, I'll elevate you to third highest ruler in all the land. Well, this makes sense because Nabonidus was number one, Belshazzar was number two, so he couldn't give Daniel number two, but he could give him number three. So all this starts to fit together, and we see, yes, there's reason to believe that this was written very much during the time of the Babylonian exile. And then this last one, Daniel chapter 8, this one also is very big, and some historians say that this is maybe the biggest point of evidence for the fact that the book was written during the time of Babylonian captivity. It's that Susa is in the province of Elam. Now, Greek historians during the time of the Maccabees knew Susa to be in the province not of Elam, but the province of Susiana, because during the time of the Persians and the Medes, remember Darius comes in? During the times of the Persians and the Medes, it was named Susiana. And again, there was no evidence pointing to a province named Elam. Nobody knew about this during the time of during the time really of the Seleucids, when the Maccabeans were around. Nobody knew about this. So this is what leads Gleason Archer, who is an Old Testament scholar, very well respected, to say this, that it is reasonable to conclude that only a very early author would have known that Susa was once considered part of the province of Elam. There would have been no way to know this unless you were there. You wouldn't have known this by looking back in history, because all of history at the time of the Maccabees agreed that no, it was in the province of Susiana, not the province of Elam. And so, what we can conclude is that the visions described in the book of Daniel and its related prophecies are truly prophetic. Right? If I wrote something 3 days from now and claimed I had written it 3 days ago, I would be a liar, and I would be a charlatan, and I would be pretending to be a prophet. But what Daniel does is he writes in a truly prophetic way, and we have many, many reasons, just these three, to say, yes, Daniel was a prophet who wrote in the time of the Babylonian captivity. Okay, with that in mind, let's jump into Daniel chapter 7. Now, I want you to see what happens in Daniel chapter 7. It's a lot like what happens in Daniel chapter 2. Then it happens again in Daniel chapter 8. Then it happens one more time before the end of the book. In the first year of King Belshazzar. Now, so Daniel is actually dating when he actually had this particular vision. Chapter 8 is another vision that happens during the time of the reign of Belshazzar. So we kind of have stepped backwards in history because we jump forward to Darius and Daniel in the lion's den. Now, this is something that happens during the time of King Belshazzar again. So rewind one king, okay? Same king of chapter 5. In the first year of King Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel had a dream, and visions passed through his mind as he was lying in bed. He wrote down the substance of his dream. Okay, so previously, I want you to see this. The visions that we have encountered in the book of Daniel were the visions of pagan kings. But these are Daniel's very own visions that we see in 7 through 12. Okay, so before he's interpreting the visions or retelling the visions of these pagan kings, now these are his own visions that God is giving to him specifically. So here the text goes on. Daniel said, in my vision at night, I looked, and there before me were the four winds of heaven churning up the great sea. So I want you to get this picture in your mind. Maybe you've been out at the beach when the waves are colliding from different directions, and it causes just this crazy kind of conflagration of the waves coming together, the water coming together, and maybe it'll push up, and it just looks really nasty and kind of scary when you're seeing that. And you think to yourself, the last thing I'd want to do is be out in that, whether I had a surfboard, a boat, swimming. I'm just going to stay out of the water. So you're seeing this scene in which the water is really churned up. It's not just coming together from two different directions. The four winds are pushing it all together, creating this massive storm upon the great sea, Daniel says. And out of that, now verse 3, four great beasts, each different from the others, came up out of the sea. The first, Daniel says, was like a lion, and it had the wings of an eagle. Okay, this is strange stuff. Okay, this is not like your normal stuff. So it had the wings of an eagle. I watched until its wings were torn off, and it was lifted from the ground so that it stood on 2 feet like a human being, and the mind of a human was given to it. And then Daniel says, there before me was a second beast, which looked like a bear. It was raised up on one of its sides, and it had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth. Okay, this is, again, strange stuff. It was told, get up and eat your fill of flesh. Then verse 6, after that, Daniel says, I looked, and there before me was another beast. And it gets stranger and stranger as we go. This one looked like a leopard, and on its back it had 4 wings like those of a bird. This beast had 4 heads, and it was given authority to rule. Okay, ready? Here we go. We're going to get one stranger. We're going to keep stepping this up. After that, in my vision at night, I looked, and it was there before me that there was this 4th beast, terrifying and frightening and very powerful. It had large iron teeth. Maybe it had bad dental habits and had to go get replacements, I don't know. It had large iron teeth. It crushed and devoured its victims and trampled underfoot whatever was left. It was different from all the other former beasts, and it had 10 horns. Daniel goes on to say, while I was thinking about the horns, I'm looking at these horns and I'm wondering, and there's a reason Daniel would be wondering about the horns. Horns were often, in the Old Testament, they were considered symbols for kings, authority, power. Okay, so it had 10 horns. Daniel says, now I saw those horns and I'm puzzled. I'm wondering, I know there's meaning to this, what I'm seeing. So now I'm starting to think about these horns. And while I'm doing that, Daniel says, there before me was another horn. It was a smaller one. He says it was a little one. It came up among them, and 3 of the first horns were uprooted before it. So 1 horn, 10 horns, 1 horn, 3 horns uprooted. This horn had, okay, man, this stuff is getting really strange now. This had eyes like the eyes of a human being, and a mouth, this little horn, that spoke boastfully. As I looked, thrones were set in place. Okay, now see what happens. And the Ancient of Days, this is God himself, took his seat. His clothing was as white as snow. The hair of his head was like white like wool. His throne was flaming with fire, and its wheels were all ablaze. Okay, so his throne has wheels on it. Everything is on fire. A river of fire was flowing, coming out before him. Thousands upon thousands attended him. 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The court was seated, and the books were opened. Now, when the books are opened, that's often the symbolism of judgment is about to come. Something's about to be recounted. Okay? So Daniel says, then I continue to watch because I was captivated, Daniel says, by the boastful words that the small horn continues to speak. It won't stop. Okay? The small horn continues to speak these boastful words. Daniel says, and I kept looking until the beast, remember the beast with 10 horns, the 1 slays the 3. I keep watching, Daniel says, until the beast itself was slain and thrown into a blazing fire. The other beasts had been stripped of their authority because, again, the book was open. Judgment is now coming out, but were allowed to live for a period of time. In my vision at night, I looked, and there was before me one like a son of man coming with the clouds of heaven. And maybe this language is familiar to you. If you remember toward the end of Matthew's gospel, Jesus is actually speaking in very similar terms. He speaks of himself as the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven. So he, now the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven, approached the Ancient of Days and was led into his presence. He was given all authority, glory, and sovereign power. Okay, so this is maybe ringing familiar with some scenes from the New Testament. We can kind of piece some of this together. All nations and peoples of every language worshiped him. Now, this is what Daniel goes on to say. His dominion was an everlasting dominion that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed. Now, what Daniel's about to say next to me is an understatement, right? Daniel says, I was troubled in spirit after seeing all this crazy stuff where I would wake up and I would feel like I've had a horrible nightmare, and I would even wonder, what is coming after me? I'm not sure what's going on here. And Daniel was troubled in spirit in that moment because what the visions that had passed through his mind disturbed him. Again, understatement of maybe all of Scripture right there. I approached one of those standing there. Okay, so the vision is still ongoing in this moment. And Daniel is actually able to approach what is probably an angel and engage with this angel. And he asked him the meaning of everything that he had seen. So he gave me the interpretation of these things. The four great beasts are four kings that will rise from the earth, four earthly kingdoms. But the holy people, the Most High, will receive the kingdom and will possess it forever, yes, forever and ever. Now, if we go to Daniel 2, we can go back to the statue where we had Nebuchadnezzar. He was the head of gold. Remember kind of the Medo-Persian Empire, the silver, then Alexander the Great in Greece, and then you got the Ptolemies, and then you've got the Seleucids after that, and then Rome then being divided. And you can kind of overlay maybe to some degree these kingdoms, and you can to some degree anyway, these kingdoms now that are being talked about in Daniel chapter 7 over top of what we believe to be true about Daniel 2. Okay, so we can do some of that. That gets more difficult with some of the following chapters as you go. And so it leaves you wondering, what exactly is the interpretation? We'll get to that in a minute. And I'm just going to give it away. I'm going to leave you hanging because we're kind of left hanging with this to some degree, right? So Daniel goes on to say this now. Not surprisingly, then I wanted to know the meaning of the fourth beast, because so far all he's been told is, hey, these beasts you saw are four kingdoms that will rise up from the earth. That should be good enough for you. Go about your day, Daniel. And Daniel says, hold on here. That's not nearly good enough. I need to know the meaning of the fourth beast, the one that I've been thinking about. The other three, they're a little bit disturbing, but this fourth beast that is terrifying has 10 horns. One comes up and takes out 3 of the 10. I mean, I'm really wondering about this horn, and Daniel says, because it's different from all the others. And it's the most terrifying, with its iron teeth and bronze claws, the beast that crushed and devoured its victims and trampled underfoot whatever was left. Daniel says, I want to know about that one. And he goes on to say, I also wanted to know about the 10 horns on its head and about the other horn that came up. I want to know these things, before which 3 of them fell, the horn that looked more imposing than the others and had eyes and a mouth that spoke boastfully. He goes on to say this in verse 21. As I watched, this horn was waging war against the holy people and defeating them until the Ancient of Days came and pronounced judgment. Okay, so this one horn raging war against against God's people, and was defeating them. Persecuting, defeating them, waging war against them. They looked like they weren't going to win. Their chance of winning was over until the Ancient of Days, again God, came and pronounced judgment in favor of the holy people of the Most High. And the time came when they possessed the kingdom. Okay, so real quick, just want you to see. Daniel is saying to this angel, could I have a few more details? I bet he's wondering, what kingdom are we talking about? And when is all this going to happen? And here's what the angel gave them for an explanation. The fourth beast is a fourth kingdom that will appear on the earth. And it will be different. As you notice, Daniel, it's different from all the others. It will be different from all the other kingdoms and will devour the whole earth, trampling it down and crushing it. The 10 horns, he goes on to say, are 10 kings who will come from this kingdom. After them, another king will arise, different from the earlier ones. He will subdue three kings. Now, these are pretty specific things. Okay, and again, if this is a king rising up from the earth, again, there's some difference from the first 3 beasts, but there's some similarities here too as well. And so these are fairly specific things. Now, listen to what the horn will do. This king, he will speak against the Most High, so he's going to speak against God. I mean, that ought to cause us to kind of catch our breath, right? He's going to speak against God himself and oppress his holy people and try to change the set times and the laws. The holy people will be delivered into his hands for a time, times, and a half of time. But the court will sit, and his power will be taken away. Again, the judgment in the books and all that. Then the sovereignty, power, and greatness of all the kingdoms under heaven will be handed over to the holy people of the Most High. And I want you to see this last line right here. His kingdom will be an everlasting kingdom. God's kingdom. God's kingdom will be an everlasting kingdom, and all rulers will worship and obey him. Now that is where this chapter lands. Now here's something I want to acknowledge. I mean, Daniel wanted more information, right? I mean, Daniel really wanted to know, could you tell me all the details about everything I've just witnessed? Tell me everything. It's not enough to know 4 kingdoms. It's not enough to know, I need to know I want details on this. Tell me about the 10 horns and the 3 and the 1, and I want to know all of this stuff. And the truth is that you and I and many, many people for many, many years, just like Daniel, would probably like a few more details concerning the exact what, when, and how of the conclusion of his vision. I mean, we'd like to know those details. But the reality is, we don't really have that. I mean, we don't really know exactly how this is all going to play out. I mean, some have tried to put this on Antiochus, roughly the time of the Maccabees, 65, 165, somewhere in that ballpark. Others have said, no, maybe this applies to AD 70 when the temple was destroyed and Rome ransacked Jerusalem. Maybe this applies. And the truth is, if you look, some of this fits both situations. But it leaves us wondering, is there something else? Does it fit those situations? Does it fit a situation maybe to come? And I think the answer is probably yes, all across the board to some degree, because in many ways, the message of Daniel is a message for generation after generation after generation after generation, especially the last bit. So we don't have the exact implication and application. And here's the truth, in spite of years of scholarly speculation, and some not so scholarly speculation as well, we might add. But here's what I want to do, is point you back to the questions we began this series with. And here's why the visions of Daniel 7 through 12 matter so much to us in this very moment. Remember the question we began this series with? How do we thrive in a time in which specific elements of the surrounding culture are becoming increasingly hostile to the worldview we hold? I mean, if you go back and look, and there's a way you can do this. You can find some of the phrases that are most searched on Google. During the last month, a lot of people with a lot of things that have been going on in the world have been searching 2 words together, and I bet you can almost guess them, right? End and times. Because people are wondering, are we nearing the end? Is this what it's going to look like? And I'm just going to stand before you and tell you, I don't know. And I'm not sure that anybody else does really either, although a lot of people would claim they do. But what I do know is this, that whatever times we're living in, we ought to be asking this question. How do we thrive? Because Christians, God's people, were always meant to thrive, no matter what was against them. No matter. Okay, so where does Daniel 7 and really Daniel 7 through 12 land? I want to quote to you and maybe you're familiar with the Bible Project. You've probably watched some of their very cleverly designed videos before, and a lot of it's pretty good stuff. Here's what they say as they're closing their series, very short series, really good, worth watching, about 9 minutes long on Daniel, the whole book. So 9 minutes for the whole book. They say this: all human kingdoms and all their leaders become arrogant and violent beasts when they don't acknowledge God's ultimate kingdom. That's the first thing they say. So any kingdom, if their leaders become arrogant and if they become violent, all of that happens when they don't first acknowledge God's ultimate kingdom. And boy, it seems like it's really tough for leaders to do that today, right? It's hard. But then they say this. Really, the conclusion of Daniel is this, that God will one day confront the beasts. God will one day confront the beast, rescuing his people and bringing his ultimate dominion, his good kingdom, over everything and everyone. And so what I want you to see as we walk through Daniel 7, which really gives us a view of Daniel 7 through 12 in many ways, as we walk through this short chapter, what I want you to know and what I want you to see, because we've ended every message during this series with a what we need statement, right? And here's what I believe we need today. As many generations have needed over and over again, what we need today are Christians who remember that above all else, the knowledge and assurance of the coming kingdom changes everything. The knowledge and assurance of the coming kingdom changes everything. Remember the second question that we've asked? I want to kind of take that question and modify it just a little bit. And I want to get you to imagine with me. Okay, imagine with me. What kind of character, attitude, and actions will a people embrace when their confidence is solidly placed in the assurance that God is ultimately victorious, no matter how things may seem in the moment? I mean, think about that with me. I mean, if you know God wins no matter what you face and no matter what you may lose, God will win. And because you're with him, you'll win along with him. What kind of confidence does that give you? I know some of you are probably sports enthusiasts, right? Let's project ourselves ahead just a little bit. And let's say you follow football. Maybe you don't. But just pretend for a second with me if you do. Or if you don't, either way. Let's project ourselves forward to the Super Bowl. And I'm not going to put any teams in there because, again, remember, I'm not a prophet. But imagine your team is in the Super Bowl. And you love football. You love professional football. Your team's in the Super Bowl. And going into the fourth quarter, they find themselves down 70-0. But what if you knew that your team was going to pull it out? You knew it. Even though it's 70-0 now, you know beyond a shadow of a doubt your team's going to pull it out. Okay, let's flip the script. What if you were down 70-0 and you had no clue what was about to happen? You may actually have turned the game off. So maybe you stop paying attention altogether. You're not even watching anymore because you're not sure. You're sure it's done. It's over. What about if you kept watching, but you're pretty sure the game's over? And I've been in situations like that before. Maybe I start even kind of talking negatively about my team. These guys really stink, man. Like, they got here, but they weren't prepared for this at all. What's their deal? They're horrible. I don't want to watch any more of this. This is sickening to me. I mean, you can imagine a whole bunch of different reactions if you did not know what was about to happen. But again, flip the script with me one more time. Let's say you did know. How would you be behaving in that moment, knowing? You might be telling your friends with you at the game, hey, watch what's about to happen. This is going to be incredible. For years and years and years, people will be telling and talking about this. Watch what's about to happen. Now, again, if you knew that was going to happen, you would be a prophet. And we should all pay attention to you. Let me remind you one more time. The visions described in the book of Daniel and their related prophecies are truly prophetic. And whatever the end looks like, we ought to be paying attention. And especially to that last part. God's kingdom is going to be an everlasting kingdom. All rulers, all authorities, in heaven and on earth will bow before him. There's a day coming when every knee will bow to Jesus. Can I tell you this? As a follower of Jesus, I'm looking forward to that day with anticipation. Incredible anticipation. That's as a follower of Jesus. It's going to be a tough day as well for those who have not decided to follow Jesus. Every knee will bow. Every tongue will confess that Jesus is Lord to the glory of the God the Father. Here's the thing. We, while we're still living, have the choice to make whether we will bow the knee now or whether we will one day bow the knee to Jesus the King, whose kingdom will last forever. And so as we land this series, first, I want to challenge, again, believers, live like you know the kingdom of God is coming and it's going to be eternal and God's going to win. Live like you know that's coming every day. Live that way. And see what kind of a difference it makes in the way you approach what's happening around us. But if you're not yet a believer, I want to offer you the invitation, the same invitation that Jesus has offered for now a couple of thousand years. To bow the knee today. To bow the knee today to say, yes, Jesus is my King. He's my Lord. In this very moment, I'm going to confess him as Lord. I'm going to put them on in baptism, and I'm going to live each day with not just the overarching big picture assurance that God's kingdom is coming, and that changes everything, but knowing because I made the choice to follow him today, my everything has been changed. So that's the challenge. Believers, live every day with the assurance that God wins. And if you're not yet following Jesus, know that your everything can be changed in this moment and for every day forward. If you want to respond this morning, you can do it the old-fashioned way by coming forward, or if you want to just grab me on the way out or grab somebody else who looks like they know what they're doing, just grab them and have a conversation and say, hey, I need to talk about what we talked about this morning. I want to take the next step in following Jesus. If that's your choice, won't you do that today? Let's stand as we sing together.